Thank you, Anthony. It's a delight to be here, and thank you for that very warm and generous introduction. I want to echo what you've said about their PhDs. I remember doing my PhD just about 15 years ago, and I struggled to finish it in a non-pandemic time, so I can't imagine. Yeah, so huge congratulations for your stamina, I think, to finishing it through that period. Yeah, I can say something really brief. I won't say much about TASO. We do actually do some work mainly on access and participation for undergraduate students, so mainly looking at access issues for as many of you will know, only about a quarter of those students on free school meals attend university, compared to 50% not on free school meals, and compared to 95% plus who go to private schools. So obviously there are major inequalities in terms of accessing higher education, and we're working with universities to look at what they're doing. So they're doing quite a lot of activities to try to improve those outcomes, but are they actually effective? But we are also doing one piece of work with UKRI and Office for Students on postgraduate retention, on Black and minority ethnic postgraduate students, working with about 10 universities, evaluating various interventions, looking to ensure that the sort of future research community is more diverse than it is presently, and so that we break some of those kind of blockages in the talent pipeline that we have in terms of, having such few Black professors in this country, for example. So that's the kind of thing that obviously I worked at Runnymede. And yeah, it was, I think, 22 years ago, nearly, 2001, when we were at the launch of that report with Bhikkhu Parekh and Stuart Hall. And the coverage was less than favorable, and it led to death threats and bomb threats, and we had to close the office, and I had to get lessons from the police on how to spot letter bombs. I won't forget that. Yeah. Anyway, that's many years ago now, but it shows if you talk about race in a particular way, particularly when you talk about the national culture. So the thing that really became a lightning rod there was the Daily Telegraph said that the report claimed that British was a racist term, and they put it in quotes. The report says British is a racist term, and actually what we had written was, for many people, the term Britishness has racialized connotations. And hopefully those of you in the audience are able to spot the difference between those two claims, even if the Daily Telegraph and even the Guardian and the BBC could not. So anyway, moving on from then to today, I'm delighted to share this, and I'm listening to both of you. I'll start with Satya. Are you going to start first? Satya Gunput, and then we'll hear from Jahan Foster. And without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so I think to start, there are probably many reasons why you may be familiar with Southall. In the first instance, some of you may live in Southall, but if not, failing that, you may have passed through the high street, like a very kinetic high street, full of clothes shops, convenience stores, eateries, and incongruously high-end jewelry stores that cater to South Asian weddings. And if you have yet to visit Southall, you probably have driven past it on the way to Heathrow Airport. It's 1.5 miles to the east of Heathrow, and to this day, Heathrow is a major employer in Southall. And if you have had no interaction with Southall in those ways, during the new Labour years of what maybe we're talking about the Parekh report, can feel like a period in comparison now, a period of sort of multicultural complacency. Southall was beamed onto our screens. It was a setting for Bend It Like Beckham, the spiritual home of Goodness Gracious Me, the comedy sketch show. But the Southall that I studied and I researched, and hopefully we can talk about today, a really radical place. Since the 1950s, it became a home to Punjabi Sikh migrants, in part because of the end of empire partition, but also other currents brought people to Southall. Connections, which were often stated to the British Indian Army, to service during the Second World War. And since the 1950s, this Punjabi Sikh community and their British-born and British families that followed, they organized against housing discrimination, racist education policies, interpersonal racism every day on the streets of Britain, against the police, against virginity testing at Heathrow Airport, domestic violence in their own communities, both national and local government at various times since they arrived in Southall. And in this way, Southall I study, and we're going to talk about today, it emerged as a crucible for a radical black politics. So in this period, we're talking about 1970s and 80s. This was a politics that sort of originated from the left and used the common experiences of racialization, so being racialized as another, and the imperial past to form a really broad-based solidarity amongst those primarily from the Caribbean and South Asia during this period. And the purpose of my research in Southall was to try to integrate this town, this outpost of West London, into the broader narrative of the anti-racism movement of Britain. So this story we tell of anti-racism movement, so the fight for racial equality in the post-war period, perhaps there's more recognizable names in Southall. So Brixton, St. Paul's, Handsworth, Tottenham, New Cross, and Mangrove. And these those places, they can often feel like almost canonical events in the story we tell ourselves about the progress towards racial equity or racial equality in Britain. And perhaps today we'll talk about why a place like Southall, with its history, can often be left off that list. So you mentioned Stuart Hall, writing, when Stuart Hall wrote after the Macpherson Inquiry, and Paul Gilroy as well, when he wrote a new edition of No Black in the Union Jack, they wrote about the broad-based solidarity that people from the Caribbean and South Asia formed, and then the list of events they used to illustrate this solidarity were exclusively the places I've already mentioned. And again, maybe we'll touch on, we can speculate why Southall was ignored. But I think the theme that I found when I was talking about Southall was how do we put it into that broader story? And we were talking about COVID. I returned to that theme during the pandemic. And I guess to give a sense of the events that affected the development of this thesis, when I first had the idea to focus on Southall was in 2016, and while sitting here today talking about this thesis, in that time we've had 2 general elections, 5 prime ministers, 1 Brexit referendum, 1 global pandemic, and probably the greatest, most notable anti-racism mobilization in 30 years in this country. And those big events, Brexit, COVID, and Black Lives Matter, they really asked a lot of questions about, again, that came out as you talked in the Parrott report, about the nation, about belonging, about unequal citizenships, about inequalities that exist in our society. And so on the way here, I was thinking how to talk about that change that came about in 2020. That it's quite hard to say, but I think, and maybe we'll discuss today, that the way we talk about race has acquired a whole new vocabulary in at least the popular realm. And I had a look at just in preparation for today, the Sunday Times bestsellers list from October 2020. So on that list included Robin DiAngelo, wrote White Fragility, Ibrahim X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Emma Dabiri, who wrote What White People Can Do Next, and Renoredo Lodge, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race. And maybe I won't comment on the content of those books, but we can talk about how they were marketed and how they're presented. And anti-racism, at least according to the Sunday Times bestseller list, is self-help manuals, personal improvement. And the vocabulary we maybe are familiar with in our workplaces, in just normal conversations we might have around privilege or around lived experience. I don't want to disparage those terms. They mean an awful lot. They can explain the world around us. But what is noticeable to me as a scholar of an earlier period is how much the language of anti-racism has been devolved from like the societal to the personal, to inhabit sort of people very, very intimately, almost genetically coded. And I think it's possible to lose track of sort of more wide-ranging ways of thinking about race and racialization. And you can end up with phrases such as structural racism or institutional racism becoming synonyms for very bad racism, rather than like an acute description of how these forces manifest and how they affect our lives. And I guess I just want to sort of round up with just 2 brief points. Is one thing that I find when we talk about Southall and trying to link it to the broader history of the anti-racism movement in Britain is this movement is tied up with empire and migration, and we can't forget those international dimensions. But the anti-racism movement that emerged in this period is tied up with Britishness, actually. That these are trends and movements that only make sense in the British context. They can only emerge in the British context. And in the case of Southall, I would say this particular anti-racist mobilization only emerges in a place like Southall in this way, with its links to empire, decolonization, life in this part of West London. And just my last reflection as a historian writing on this is to think about how we do histories of race, or black histories, or black history, or Asian history. And my personal opinion is they shouldn't just be histories of people who happen to be Asian, or histories of people who happen to be black at that given time. Instead, it's those sort of race histories, or histories of racialization, there should be invitations to think about how people have experienced, interacted with, changed, and used race as a tool of political and social transformation. And on that note, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you.
So, I kind of follow on from Satya in some ways. So when we were thinking about the shared themes or the shared ideas in both of our research, so what I'm going to do is I'll give you sort of a brief overview of what I did for my project, for my thesis, and some thoughts that we had about those common ideas. And then perhaps that could be part of our discussion later on, and questions as well afterwards. So my research was focused on a much more recent migrant community to the UK, established community, but much more recent in comparison to the communities that Satya was working with. I worked with the Latin American community in London, and I focused my work in Lambeth and Southwark, which are the 2 areas of London with the biggest populations of Latin Americans. And my research was really interested in how Latin American families, how they organise and manage their social reproduction needs, the things that they need daily and generationally to live. What work happens for life's work? So how do they sustain themselves? How do they organise the resources that they need? And I was very much interested in what children do in those families, and what is the role of children, what are children contributing to families' day-to-day needs, and how do they support the family as well as themselves to access education, to access welfare, to understand where to go to get support and advice. That was my focus. I was also really interested in how the access to those resources is administered through the state, through things like the welfare state, or through housing, or through wherever it might be. And obviously, I think as we all would agree, how that access is stratified, how that access is unequal, how different groups of people, how different migrant communities do not have the same access to those resources. So those are sort of the 2 areas that I was really interested in. How do families manage their social reproduction needs? How do they manage their life's work? And what is children's role in that work? And sort of the areas that I really focused on, if I think about the families and the parents, particularly Latin Americans, segregation to precarious forms of work, and how that then has this sort of consequential impact on how they access different services and what support they are able to find. And then when I looked at children and what children are doing in the home as well as outside the home, there were sort of different things that I found, and I thought I'd go through kind of my methodology as well, and it might be interesting, because I know there's a few students in the room as well. It might be interesting to some of you in the room. So as Omar said, and as it's already been said, my research was very much impacted by the pandemic. very much. I think almost to the day then when the first lockdown was announced was the 2 days after my first interview. So how I did my work, I worked with a community organisation in Brixton called Indo-American Refugee and Migrant Organisation. They support the Latin American community in London, and actually further afield as well. They've been around for close to 30 years, and I started volunteering with them. I supported them in their education team and their family support team, and I was helping families and parents and children get access to education, like calling up schools, following up on applications, sometimes writing applications, supporting families to get their children into education, often families and children who had recently moved to the UK. I was there for about 6 months, and then a pandemic came. So everything that I did, it moved online, and I continued volunteering with them in that way for about 2 years from that first March lockdown. And I was just supporting them online with applications. I started volunteering as an English teacher with the organisation, with the purpose that kind of embedding myself in as much as possible in the community that isn't my own community would give me some real insight into the different needs of the community and also the role of the third sector in supporting the community. It also gave me a lot of access to different groups of the community, and it enabled me to find participants for my interviews as well. So I ended up speaking to a group of young people and some parents, and then I also did some interviews with different people in professional bodies working with Latin Americans. So I spoke with Lambeth Council and Southwark Council, different schools that have large Latin American populations. I spoke with a couple of lawyers who work with the community, different community organisations. The one I work with is one of several. So I felt very strongly that I wanted to sort of embed myself as much as possible with the community and learn as much as possible from those experts working in the field, and then also use that as a space to talk about my research and see if people were interested in taking part in interviews. So I ended up doing all my interviews basically online, and for the students in the room, I think there was actually a real value as well to it. It allowed me to speak to people who I don't think I would have been able to speak to otherwise, because I spoke to them before they went to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I spoke to them at 11 o'clock at night. So I think if there's students here who are thinking about doing that type of research, it's a really valuable thing to look into to see if it would be applicable for your work. And so what I found through speaking to the young people, mainly in my project, was really just the important contribution that children are making in the homes, and the contribution they're actively choosing to make as well, both for themselves but also for their family and the community more broadly. And that was in sort of areas that I guess you might expect, so cooking and cleaning and caring for siblings, but it was also in terms of language brokering, translating and interpreting for their families, and being this kind of connector often between the public and the private spheres, speaking to GPs, going to the supermarket and helping the families to get the right food, or going to housing association appointments, or speaking to their schools and translating at parents' evenings. There was all these different ways that the young people I was working with were really active contributors to their family, and they weren't just these sort of passive people just receiving care and receiving support from their families. They were taking this very agentic role. And it was, in some cases, some of the young people I spoke with, they were also going to work with their parents. Their parents would take them to work with them, cleaning jobs, for example, and there's no other childcare. They would take their children with them, and the kids would sometimes help out. And again, it was sort of something that they saw a lot of value in, they saw it as a contribution, but I think it also pointed to the different ways that different communities are compelled to strategize in different ways, are different ways that families have to make up that support and that work, and how children become involved as a result. So when Satya and I were thinking about the kind of shared themes, we thought that, for example, with my community, the Latin American community that I worked with, they're a relatively new community, and all the people that I spoke with came after 2008, after the economic crisis. That is also when the majority of Latin Americans in this country migrated, because they'd been living in Spain before. The effect of the crisis was much more severe in Spain. A lot of people moved to the UK after that. And we were sort of thinking with communities that Satya worked with, as you said, they had this imperial relationship to the UK, and as sort of British subjects, and they sort of claimed that entitlement, rightly so, to the resources that were available, to what the state should provide. And there was something quite interesting about the community I worked with, who didn't have that same imperial relationship to the UK, didn't have the same sense of using the welfare state as well, for example. That wasn't something that was particularly common perhaps in their countries of origin. So there was something really interesting to see how the community found other ways to get support, using their children and the children playing that important role, but using the third sector as well. The third sector really taking on this really important role. And something sort of very interesting around how, as a community, Latin Americans, a lot of them with European citizenship, and what that meant as well for how they access services and how they access support, and then obviously now what that means in the aftermath of Brexit. So I think that would be quite an interesting discussion that maybe we can have, and it'll be interesting what you think, Omar, because I think that was sort of the comparison between our two studies, but also something that was shared, thinking about how different communities navigate and claim ownership of what they should be getting as well, because the state should be providing it. That was kind of also the main thing. The state should have been providing these resources. Communities should have been able to access it, and they weren't able to, and all because of all the different barriers that they face. So I think maybe I'll end there.
Real. I think it's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to kick us off. I don't know if either of you want to start a little conversation between the two of you first, or do you want me to? Did you have any reflections on that? And then maybe I'll ask Jahan, and then I'll ask my first question.
I think that I was just going to pick up on the point Jahan said, which is it's absolutely true, but the major difference in terms of the migrant communities we talk about is that imperial connection. And in the case of Southall, in the initial sort of period of migration of the 50s, you have people claiming, mainly men who come over. That's in this wave of migration in Southall. It's Punjabi men coming over, in part pushed away because of partition, but also when they arrive in Britain, they lay claim to having fought alongside the British in the Second World War. And actually the local legends that appear in Southall at a rubber factory near Hayes, where Punjabi men working there claim with some reason that the personnel manager of the factory actually works and served alongside Punjabi Sikhs, and this is why he recognizes their virtues, their hard-working nature, by rewarding them with really horrible jobs in a really heavy industry which takes years of their life. And sometimes when I was talking with people, interviewing people more recently about it, that same myth occurs in 2020 when I was talking to people. And when I was talking to Jahan about this, we thought about how it's not necessarily the most progressive way of thinking about migrant entitlements.
Yes.
And I think even more recently, there are examples of that. The refugee crisis that came out of Afghanistan or Sudan. What was interesting with Afghanistan was how, well, those who served for the British or helped the British, they should come to Britain. Or in Sudan, oh, well, these are families of NHS workers, or these are NHS doctors, they should come to Britain. And actually this, what have you done for the British form of migration, it's really strong in sort of those myths we tell. And I think when you talk about a community that can't call upon that, that was the thing that stood out for me. That like, what sort of tales you tell about your belonging, how do you construct your place in Britain? And Jahan obviously talks about children being that sort of key, I don't know how you describe it, but that way of entering into that sense of belonging.
Yeah, and I think sort of to follow on from what you were saying, there is something that comparison is really interesting, because as a community, the Latin American community does a lot of back and forth movement as well, pre-COVID or in just that period before COVID and also pre-Brexit as well. There was a lot of back and forth movement between countries in Europe, like Spain and Portugal, and London, and there's a kind of different, I guess, conception of the UK of a place to go to, because you can go, then you can come back, and you might the children might go by themselves and stay with extended family already living here, or stay with the parents already come, but the parent might come back at some point. There's a lot of movement going back and forth. I think it was interesting, particularly in my research, to see how much that stopped because of COVID, because when borders were closed, and that same sort of movement wasn't able to happen, and how people felt about their sense of belonging in London and what that meant, and when people couldn't as easily find those connections. I think there was something really interesting about that, but also really powerful in terms of how the community still did manage to find out, seek out the community organisations that would be able to help, or find other people who would understand how to find housing, find jobs, find whatever it might be. So it was a sort of very specific moment, and a really sort of interesting insight into that movement and that kind of transnational migration that would have been happening and going back and forth.
Yeah, it reminds me, I did some research just before Brexit with ethnic minority communities and their attitudes towards Brexit. And one of the things that definitely came out strongly, and we know that about a third of Black and Asian people voted to leave, and I did speak to some of those leaving ethnic minority voters, and there was resentment about the differentiated rights that EU migrants had, and this was very much part of it. Like, we came in the 50s and 60s and had this harder time. The British state didn't extend to us welfare rights, and yet we have a... So on the one hand, I could see the kind of, there's a sort of panoply of different rights and entitlements that different kinds of migrants have had, and that is a reality, but it's one that has often, I think, been hidden by the way in which we talk about hyperdiversity as a kind of thing. But I'm curious, do you see within that, scope for solidarities and understandings and connections? Because obviously that's a difficult basis, if that's the sort of structural basis on which different migrant and ethnic minority communities are situated here, and they have different access to, say, imperial belonging or narratives about contribution to World War II or World War I. My grandfather was a Punjabi member of he fought in India in the 40s. So it's a very big part of even my family's self-perception. Yeah, but that can be a barrier to building solidarities with other communities, right? So it's kind of on the one hand, it's this positive story of continuous hyperdiversity, new migrant communities. On the other hand, experiences aren't just different, but kind of unequal, right?
I think, in the example of Southall, people are quite flexible with the mixed values.
Yeah.
So in the 50s and 60s, in my research, you find people at the time writing about military service, mainly in the Second World War, but not entirely. By the time you get to the 70s, when you have a series at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and you have a series of what we sort of call race riots, but I understand people might not want to call them that way, uprisings or whatever. It's interesting how in order to gain legitimacy, it's no longer we serve the British, but a younger generation will say, well, actually, we fought the British. So Punjabis, Sikhs in Southall, this younger generation of British Sikhs, start saying, well, the history of Britain in Punjab is the Amritsar massacre. And we fought the British and we were the only ones to do so. And we're not like these other groups who didn't. And actually, it's a new generation trying to talk about sort of their politically black identity by calling up a different imperial myth. And while I don't know how that will necessarily fit with the more recent migrants who don't have those connections, it should say that across generations, people can be selective. And sometimes people can be selective across their lifetime as well. So I don't think we should disregard that flexibility that does exist sometimes.
Yeah, identity is about craft as much as just tapping into a pre-existing. Yeah. Do you have any thought? Do you feel that the community you're working with sees those links, or are they so concerned about, understandably, the kind of precarious situation they are in, and the children are supporting them, that they're not actually thinking, not in a negative way, but literally they don't have time, or especially during COVID, to think about building solidarities with other migrant communities, or is that part of their kind of thinking?
I think that was something that was interesting about the community I was working with, because they were such recent arrivals, that there is a kind of immediacy to strategizing how you're going to access resources.
Yes.
There's just an immediate need for how do you find work and how do you find a school for your kid.
Yeah.
But I think also from my research and from all the existing research as well with the community, that actually even with legally entitled access to resources or to support from the state, the community still doesn't have that access, because the migrant is still excluded in different ways. And so I think there is that space for solidarity, because the access isn't about which migrant group are you, and are you a European citizen, or are you a British subject, or you're still other. So I think, and the various ways that plays out on a day-to-day basis. So I think that there is scope for solidarity, and I think in the moment that I was speaking with people, COVID was the main thing that people were focused on, and particularly seeking out support through the organisation I was working with. But I think also because of the nature of London, that even though this community organisation works predominantly with Latin American families, that there's Latin America is made up of many countries.
Yes, yeah.
And so there's still those connections between different countries and different experiences, and then just also being situated in London and what that means for who you speak to, and how community organisations also share resources as well, I think, and share support. And so that means that people, I think, do see the experiences of other groups beyond perhaps the group they've been put into.
And if I can just quickly pick up on something, I think we talked about this just before coming here, is that there are examples of groups that have survived from, there's one example of a group that has survived from the 70s that has quite a broad-based solidarity, and it's in Southall, the Southall Black Sisters. And what's interesting about them is today they provide services to women fleeing domestic violence or who have issues with immigration or accessing the provisions of the state, women of colour. And this has more or less been their mission since 1979, and it hasn't changed. And we were discussing earlier how it is perhaps, I think, the only organisation that has survived unchanged from that period of activism in Southall. And one interesting thing is that it comes from that black politics, that really radical black politics, which was about broad solidarities. And that it still attempts to do that. I think one way it manages to do that is by being really focused on service provision. That if a woman of colour is in need in Southall, regardless of her background, they can provide a service, whether legal services, whether refuge services. And the political consciousness raising part of that organisation is subsequent to that service provision. And just as Jahan was saying, that so much about how migrants access the state is about that provision, well, there are examples of groups that can still maintain that. And in the Southall context, it's just interesting that they come from that period of activism around the Southall riots. They've survived since then.
Sorry, I'm going to, I guess, challenge you a bit on that. Not on Southall Black Sisters per se, but I was just reflecting on, I mean, I don't disagree with you looking at the bestsellers in October 2020 and looking at those texts. But I guess it's not just the text that have shifted. Even that own description you said is the sort of mobilization. So it's not just that anti-racist popular texts don't necessarily have a structural or institutional or sophisticated account of racism. It's even the sort of organizations on the ground are now quite weak and thin. And, you know, if Southall Black Sisters is the only one left, you know, how do you see the scope for, you know, building on the fact that there has been increased consciousness of the nature of racism in British society, how can we take that moment and turn it into something more productive then? Not just in terms of getting better books on the bestseller list, but getting a movement that in 2023, young Black and Asian people in Britain feel represents them, young migrants, and even white British people want to stand behind under that umbrella to fight for a form of anti-racist politics that is more aligned to what you're talking about in terms of Southall Black Sisters. And how do we enable newer migrants who are in precarious situations or maybe just struggling to survive? It's a tall order to ask them to be politically conscious if they can't even, you know, secure housing or education for their children.
Maybe in a more thematic sense, to start with, is to think about how, because we're effectively talking about Black Lives Matter as that moment of mobilization, and to think about how we can sort of make a sort of effective campaigning in Britain.
Yes.
Then I think that anti-racism sort of mobilization has to speak to the situation in Britain and the history that exists of that movement. And one thing, when I was doing interviews with perhaps younger people in Southall, or talking to people who are younger in Southall, is the refrain that recurs frequently is, nothing has changed. And I think that's false. And part of that is like a denial of historical change, and maybe reintroducing, as I mentioned in the introduction, the sort of the Britishness of this anti-racism movement, showing the parts of it which have been successful and what they're built on, like in a broad thematic sense. I think that would be quite successful, because I don't mean it as a slight or as a deep criticism, but Black Lives Matter is something that we look to the US and it's come to Britain, and we are making sense of it, how we use this language, these tools, to make something work on a community level here. And that it hasn't immediately worked within 2 years or 3 years. It's not sort of the end of the world. I think there's more working out to do.
I mean, I'm asking you. I mean, it's a task for all of us in this room, and it's obviously a big, difficult task. So I'm not expecting you to have an answer, but I think it is interesting how that intellectual challenge isn't just an intellectual one, right? I think there's kind of conditions of the experience of people living in Britain, young people in particular. That, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Good question. Getting rid of the government would be a start. Kicking them out. I mean, I think because of my experience working so closely with this organisation, I really saw the power of them and just the knowledge that they had and how much they were in the community and how much they were supporting different parts of the community and how they worked with schools and different people on the ground, you know, and with the local authorities. And so I just think there was such a space there. And I know that they do really sort of fantastic political work as well, and they are very much about raising that awareness of the community and what the community needs. So for me, that was a really powerful thing of the work that they were doing, and I think there's space there for that kind of that movement.
Yeah, and I think it raises an interesting kind of question, like, is it actually going to be more productive and effective? Even you're focusing geographically. You know, maybe that big chat that Runnymede had about Britishness and the nation, it's too abstract and high level. Where we're going to succeed is at that local level, building up connections, building up lived experience with neighbors, and building up rather than trying to top down, give an account of a kind of theoretically neat multicultural version of Britishness, right?
When we talked about Stuart Hall, obviously someone like Paul Gilroy talks about an organic multiculture, that we're not going to have to look to the state to structure what Britishness looks like in a multi-ethnic and a multicultural place, but actually around most of our cities we have these interactions already.
Yeah.
And it's maybe a question of how to recognize that, and almost more like airy-fairy way, be proud of it.
Yeah.
But I'm not necessarily going to solve racism.
I think that's an interesting, but I think for both of you it's kind of interesting. I think that you do need to start, that's my view as well. I think that starting locally, it's kind of where people learn to rub along and meet different people, right? I mean, and the point around services isn't just that they're public, but they're often provided at a local level, right? Schools are neighborhoods. You know your teacher. You know if you don't have childcare, you know, maybe a neighbor will pick up the kid for you, and that neighbor might be from a different background or something, or the same background, but there's opportunity there, right? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I completely agree. I think that local level of where services actually get enacted and where people actually get the provision, and that's where that's also where you see barriers. That's where you see people come up against racist, discriminatory practices, is also at the local level. But I think there is definitely that space there. That's how you make those connections. We live in this national sense, yes, but our interactions, as you said, are in the day-to-day and in the local. And for me, it was what was most powerful about this work.
Should I open it up to the audience? Do we have some questions? Yes, we definitely have some questions, so maybe I'll take these. Okay, I'll take these two first, and then there's one in the back, but I'll take these two first.
Both of your communities have a faith background. Did you discover how strong the temple at Sikh Temple and the Catholic Church for the Latin American community was in supporting what?
Let's just take one more and then...
In school, and what is always a challenge is time and resources and so on. And I'm really interested to hear about the significance, obviously, of children in the community that you've been working with, Jahan. And I was interested to know about, and you just mentioned barriers, I was interested to know about the barriers that you came across in terms of how schools were interacting with the community and what schools were achieving, but just as importantly, what they weren't achieving or what they weren't doing for those communities, and therefore how that could potentially be refined and improved.
I'll have you start, that one, and maybe also the one about religion, faith communities.
So I think the things that, in the context of schools, that they weren't doing, there were structural issues, but they were also, I think, around individual attitudes. So there is generally just a lack of provision for English language teaching and a lack of support for young people that don't speak English as a first language. So that already creates, obviously, that additional barrier within the schools. Then there's also, and this is the experience of the community organisations I work with, said there's a kind of a reluctance, it seems, as well, for schools to accept young people that don't speak English to a level that they assess, especially if young people come to the UK and then need to enter school at an exam year. So there's this kind of reluctance, and I saw it in my volunteer work, and then I the staff that I spoke with as well sort of said the same thing. There just seems to be this reluctance from schools to taking young people at year 11 when that's the year they should be in, and that's the education level they're at. So that means that then young people end up missing a year of school or going to the year below, and then the kind of impact of that as they progress through their schooling. I think some of the barriers are also around what schools could be doing to better inform their communities about how to get into school. I think the system is very complicated if you're not an English language speaker.
It's hard if you are.
Even
Having
if
just got my son into a secondary school,
Yeah.
I was like, the guidance I got from the council was not correct.
Yeah, even if you are, it
Yeah.
is just very complicated. And I think, from my experience, schools rely on very dedicated teachers to fill that gap. So there was a sort of like a community leader who is just really well known in Southwark and in Lambeth, who is just the go-to point for Latin American families, because she will tell them, okay, this school's really good, they've got really good English language provision, okay, I'll help you with this application. And that information was also being shared outside of the UK. It was being shared with people already in Spain who are about to move, for example. So the fact that there's just one person who has to be known, I think also shows what schools could be doing to better support the communities that they know are in their borough, for example. So I think, those are sort of the main things. It's really around like English language provision, but then discriminatory practices within the schools and from perhaps teachers at times, encouraging children, young people to not speak their mother tongue, to only speak English, and the barriers that also creates young people in education. So I'd say those are sort of the main issues basically that I found.
Just on the school things, it actually bears a really interesting historical parallel with Southall, because Southall had a busing policy for basically South Asian children.
Yeah.
There was a worry that they wouldn't speak English, which in most of the tests they did, they found the children had a passable English, good enough English to go to school. It effectively was a huge political scandal in the House of Commons. We must do something about schools which have more than 30% immigrant children. And they ended up busing them. Maybe you had a 2-hour ride in the morning from primary school kids, secondary school kids, to go be educated in a majority white school. But even if you got there, they would stick you in a separate classroom to have remedial English lessons, almost completely defeating the purpose. And what followed of that was you don't have extracurricular activities, no parents can't be involved, all that. And hearing the stuff about English language provision, well, and it's also worth comparing with something like at the same time, Southall in Bedford, there's a huge Italian migrant community which didn't have a busing policy, because clearly in this period I write about race matters. And maybe it does today as well, I'm not going to comment on that. But in this particular political scandal, you have an Italian community in Bedford, a South Asian community in Southall. One is a political panic that must be bust and affects all their English language provision.
I think it's a good example also, as an American who has obviously I agree with you that also you sort of a wider point that you've been making, that yes, there are obviously similarities of racialization and of the experience of race and ethnicity and anti-racism in the US and the UK, but there's a different history here too. And people don't know about this busing history. And another thought is, it is the 60th anniversary this year of the Bristol bus boycott, and people, don't really know about that. We learn more about Rosa Parks than we learn about Bristol, right? And it's the 60th anniversary this last month. Anyway, there was also the question though that we haven't answered about faith, or I think not just faith, but I think those religious institutions, right?
So in Southall you have a Gurdwara Sikh temple, and at least historically, it's worked as a de facto community centre, providing newspapers, news from back home, before the internet age, and also a way of providing help to the community, social help. But all of this comes with sort of a health warning that there can sometimes be really conservative practices of keeping families together or resolving issues within families, which aren't necessarily a net positive. And you do have groups that have to emerge to cater to a changing community. And then I guess the other thing I would say in Southall, that the Gurdwara from the Sikh temple in the 80s gets really associated with movement for Palestine, an independent Sikh homeland. sort of which is recurring as a political issue today, not just in the time of Indira Gandhi. But yeah, I think, like I said, they played a key role, but I think that it's sort of important to sort of not lionize it or heroize it too much, but there are reasons organizations have had to step in at times for a newer generation whose attachment to their religion may differ. Yeah.
Any thoughts about Catholic? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was important. I mean, in terms of people I spoke with, again, because of COVID, so there wasn't people going to churches because they couldn't. But when they're in those brief moments when things are open, there was that movement, and the churches are very important to the community as well as just spaces where people can meet other Latin American people and have a service in Spanish. So I think they were more meeting points and focal points for new communities arriving and to learn about things and get information and resources. There was a really interesting, I thought, example from one of the young people I spoke with, though, who in a sort of a brief moment when you could go out, rather than going to a Spanish-speaking church, she went to an English-speaking church because that's where she wanted to learn English. And so she really actively chose to go there so that she could learn English, because she couldn't go to schools were closed and she hadn't got into a school at that point either. So I just thought also that was just a really interesting way of how she used her faith as well to do something else, just to learn English. That's what she was going there for.
I'm aware the drinks are here, but I think there's a few more questions, so I'll take 5-10 more minutes. There's one here, but the man in the back had a question first, actually. Yeah, you, and then I'll take. Yeah.
I wanted to apologies. I wanted to drag us back to the point you made about the way the publishing industry captured Black Lives Matter and marketed it in this entirely kind of, as you say, like liberal self-improvement frame, and ask about the general tendency for that kind of capture. So I saw it similarly happen within civil society organisations, where ideas like lived experience became quickly like this kind of act of HR enclosure, basically. Or you see obviously the climate movement can sometimes focus on the individual consumer rather than engagement with like fossil capitalism. You know, even this kind of anti-carceral movement has elements of that. So that tendency, where does that cash out in terms of dealing with these kind of intersecting crises and the type of solidarities that we're going to need, and the type of class consciousness building that we're going to need to deal with them? Because it's very observable with the question of race, where it's a tendency again across a number of kind of arenas. I know that's a really ludicrously big question, but
Yeah, well, it's fine. They're academics. They're doctors, both of them. That's. There's one question here. Is there any other question? I'll take one more if there is, and then that will be probably it, because it's. Is that yes? Yeah. Okay. Here. Yes.
Did you notice any interesting changes in voting behaviour amongst these immigrant groups? For example, what comes to my mind is the Gujarati community in Harrow, for example, have switched from Labour to Conservative over time, and that's sort of reflected by the successes of the PM and the Home Secretary for now. Were they? Were for this more for Satya? What was the Punjabi? Did this have an effect really on the Punjabi community? Seeing not the same Indian community, but a different one have success on such a national scale politically.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw, the BJP did make an announcement that Ealing Southall was going to swing to the Conservatives. It was one of they produced a list of 20 seats that they claimed would all become Conservative seats.
Omar, you mentioned a sort of a pre-Brexit sentiment.
There was,
EU freedom of movement, and so I wonder how that's changed over time.
Yeah, so I'll kick it off. Okay, I'll do the last one first, and then the publishing one. When we talk about voting behaviour, the first thing to say is polling for ethnic minority voting is really unreliable, and it's really hard to do. But like in terms of sort of broad things, we can say just who holds seats. Southall has been pretty solidly Labour for a long time, almost because the community that migrated here were very involved in sort of workplace politics and it was a very sort of almost seamless transition. The men you, I'm saying men because they were men you saw involved in workplace politics appeared in parts of the Labour Party and in representation. And if we're talking about sort of that sort of representation more broadly, the Labour Party, when it comes to putting forward ethnic minority candidates, tends to put them in ethnic minority majority seats. So there's a reason why the MP for Southall right now is a South Asian man, who is quite absentee, I think, when it comes to how he interacts with Southall. But Rishi Sunak is for William Hague's old seat, because that's how the Conservative Party sort of deal with their diversity there. In terms of the Gujarati community, or that Gujarati community in Harrow, we're talking about people forced out of Uganda and Kenya because of Africanization policies. And the sort of currents that go into that community are about class, citizenship status, which was very different when they came over, religion, things like caste, which I think is perhaps less well commented upon in British politics because it's very complicated, very hard to understand in the British context because of the way we code migration sometimes. In terms of whether having lots of South Asians in power affects how people in Southall will vote, a Punjabi community, maybe it's perhaps hard to tell, other than I would say some of these community differences can hark back to sort of, we say, Indian politics. So we had almost communal, I don't know what to call them, clashes in Leicester, which was about the BJP and other organizations talking about Hindu and Muslim identity. And those sorts of sticking points, they're I think maybe the next election we'll see, but I think they're here to stay. This will be a new feature of...
Links also to some of the second question. Sorry, I'm going to push you on a bit. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. For the publishing industry, I think, and where it cashes out, I think people call it the neoliberalization of the struggle. I don't know where it'll end other than the institutions that seem to be very keen on this have never been the institutions people have looked for their liberation. So that's never been where people have looked for. Corporations or I don't know, investment banks having a diversity working group, like no one's ever looked there to find out how they solve these problems we live through. So like Omar said, like Jahan said, some of these come from below, our sort of organic multiculture, our communities, our interactions in the day-to-day. But I recognize that tendency as well.
Yes, sorry, I don't want to. I have a lot of things I'd like to say, but it's not my. No. I want to give Jahan the last word.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I can speak necessarily to changes in voting behaviour in terms of the community I work with, other than to say I think there'll be something really interesting that could emerge in terms of Brexit because of so much of the community are European citizens, and so many of them needed the support of this organisation to figure out how to do their settled status, for example, and whether that's still continuing and how people are trying to navigate this new citizenship status and also what that means for their voting rights as well, I think will be really interesting to see. But it was interesting, sort of in terms of my research, just there's these sort of two crises coming together, COVID and Brexit, that I went in thinking that Brexit would be this huge thing for people, that it would be like top of their priorities, and because of COVID and because COVID showed how much just getting the day-to-day work done, how COVID really made that clear, Brexit was sort of just way down the bottom of the list. And that was quite unexpected for me, so I went in really thinking that would be important, and it just wasn't at that particular moment. So I'd really be interested now, 3 years on, to know how people are navigating that, what they think of them in terms of their rights to vote, for example.
I was really struck also when you were talking. I realized I was sort of linking that up, that this happened under lockdown, your research, and you were talking about children going, out to work with people who are cleaners. I mean, obviously that meant that those children were potentially exposed in a way that, you know, middle-class people working at home on Zoom were not. So was that actually happening? Were children actually going into houses in that way during your research?
It wasn't so much houses, more I guess like offices and
Offices,
things.
yeah. But even so, that's
But
that's
and I think
you know, yeah, just reminds us as well of this sort of we were not really all in this together, were we?
no, exactly.
I'm not happy now. No, well, we are all in this room together to continue the conversation. I really want to thank both of them for their excellent work, but also for their time tonight. The way that you guys interacted is really a fruitful conversation, a lot of interesting shared themes, but also some different things. And as I said, I think lots for us to learn from here in the room, but also for us to think about how we enact some of the kind of questions that we've brought up today in terms of how communities get along together, how can we be part of those kinds of conversations and activities beyond just reading sort of self-help books, as you say. Although I think Emma's
Emma's different.
I think
different,
Emma
yeah.
DeBerry's book is
But the way it's marketed is not.
is not a self-help book. That's not just because I know her. I think it's a better book than that. But anyway, we're also very grateful for the drinks that are about to be served. And so I think without any further ado, if you could give our speakers